Okay, so this video is all about resampling. I'm just going to show a couple different really simple sounds and what I did to them to turn them into basically completely different sounds. For my starting points, I chose noise, sine waves, one case, almost complete silence, and I turned them into radically different sounds using pretty simple techniques. Everything's pretty readily available to basically everyone with a decent DAW. I do use a lot of kilohertz stuff, but you don't need kilohertz stuff to do this. There is some band splitting in the case of multipass, but that's nothing major. So I'm just going to quickly demo the start points and the end points, and then I'm going to briefly go over how I made them. We'll start at the top with the noise floor sound. I'm not exactly sure it's just noise floor. There is some low clicking because what I started with was 3x oscillator, and 3x osc is really not a clean synth. It's really noisy. If you've ever played a saw wave or anything, and you've probably noticed the aliasing if you've looked at a visualizer of some kind. So I figured it'd be a pretty good place to start because this sound is basically all about taking the noise floor and gaining it up a whole lot. I took out the original sine wave. It is actually a sine wave played at the lowest note on the keyboard. And with the effects, it's a lot different. So to start off, I compressed it a lot. Snap Heap and OTT are basically doing the same thing. Maximus, I compress it very heavily again with some saturation at the end, basically clipping it. And I also have a clipper on at the end, and I'm boosting it 35 decibels into the ceiling, and it's being hard clipped, so it's basically distorting a lot. In the Snap Heap, I have two LFOs that are random, and they're modulating the delay and the frequency shifter. Originally, the delay and the bit crush were not in the Snap Heap, so it sounded like this. And the delay is basically adding that stereotypical changing the delay time while your sound is playing effect. I'm not downsampling the sound, I'm just doing some bit reduction, basically 4 bits, which is making it a lot crunchier, quote unquote, if I'm allowed to use buzzwords. which is changing the sound a fair bit. So that's what I have at the end of it. So that gets us our first iteration. After that, I'm taking iteration 1 and I'm putting it into a granulizer, so it sounds like this. Without effects, and now I'm going to turn effects on. So it's just some simple compression and clipping. In Maximus, I like to do this. It's simple, but it's a neat trick. So I'll take up the point that is at negative infinity and I'll gain it up to the point that it's about like -9, -7 decibels, and that basically makes the sound really loud. I usually have this all the way down. I guess I forgot though. It doesn't really do anything. It's fairly useless. So some really heavy compression, more or less, and then just a clipper at the end. It's not being gained 35 decibels up this time, but it's still there. Probably doesn't need to be. I could probably just clip in Maximus, but whatever. So that gets us iteration 2. So in the granulizer, the attack is all the way down, and I'm messing with the grain spacing and wave spacing, which is basically the playback and the space between the grains. And with the pattern, I will change the start point so I get a different sound every time the note plays. I have a volume envelope with sustain down, but with a bit of hold, so it plays for a while, and then a pitch LFO, which is making that pitch sound effect. It's modulating the pitch slowly. So when I did that, I loaded it up into Edison and I denoised it by itself. So how that works is you will click on the brush icon and you can acquire the noise profile. And then once it's done that, you click on the brush again and you click accept, and it basically denoises it by itself. I'm not going to do it on camera because it takes a really long time, but it takes out a lot of noise, and you usually just end up with a lot of the really resonant peaks. So I have this at this point. This is iteration 3. The last iteration is fairly simple. I just load it into a granulizer again. The attack is all the way down, makes the sound more aggressive, and randomness is all the way up. And that basically turns the sound into a weird texture machine. Without the random all the way up, it sounds like basically a slowed down version of the original. But with the randomness all the way up, I'm getting grains from all over the sound. That's your first sound. Second sound, I actually used noise. This is also in 3x oscillator. The only thing that is worth mentioning other than that is I'm using oscillator 3 to modulate the amplitude of the noise, and I'm playing a really low note. The oscillator is down 2 octaves, and then I'm playing F2, so it's a really low note. What I'm doing in the mixer channel, if we just turn it on. So in the first multipass, I'm ring modulating the highs with the lows. So if you have multipass, you can ring modulate certain bands by other bands. And in this case, it's the highs being modulated by the lows. I'm also dispersing and distorting everything, then distorting everything in post, limiting it, and then ring modulating the whole thing as well by a fairly low frequency. The second multipass has processing that kind of looks like what you would see in a growl process. There is a high pass with a fairly steep Q, and that's coming up fairly often against a band pass, which is in the low mids, and a peak filter, which is kind of all over the place, and then a comb filter on the highs. and then dispersion and limiting as well. And the reason this seems like something you would see out of a growl rack is I initially was trying to make a growl out of noise. Didn't really work out. I ended up getting something fairly different. I did try to add a vocoder. I didn't really like it, but I kept it anyway. Clipper on the end as well. So that gets us iteration 1 and 2. After that, I'm taking iteration 1 and I'm doing more processing on it. So I have a noise gate taking out all the quieter peaks, and then I've got more dispersing going on. Basically the very lowest frequencies are being dispersed. Then I'm distorting it, I'm limiting it, and then actually what I'm doing here is I'm applying a reverse gate to the sound. So I'm taking out all the sounds that go above the threshold. After that, I take out the lows because there are a lot of lows in this sound. Just play it. Without the filter, there is just a lot of low end that I don't need. After that, transient shaping, and I'm boosting it 20 decibels into a limiter, and then clipping it even more. There's that heavy boosting coming back, but not quite as drastic. I didn't really need as much this time, just 20 decibels, I guess, which is it's not that much. It's a subtle mixing move. So iteration 3 is what you get at the end of the chain. That brings us to our endpoint. So I actually got two different sounds here. This one in particular doesn't have these two effects, but we're going over all of them. So I took out a lot of lows again, and then I took stereo shaper and I dephased the left and right channels, so that basically fucks up mono compatibility a little bit. That was fine. Next I distorted it using a sine shaper. Pre-gain all the way up, not too heavy though. And then a clipper on at the end. I decided to use fastest this time, but fastest is not really distorting it, it's just clipping off everything that goes over 0 decibels. So that gets us 4B. And then 4A, Fruity Delay 3 is basically a slapback at 250 milliseconds with a stereo offset to create almost a flam-like effect between the left and right channel. I'm modulating the time with an LFO, and then I actually did vocode it again. This band distribution graph is a preset, it's the Mel scale. A lot of stuff in Vocodex is just by ear. There's like, I like Vocodex. I just have a sort of love-hate relationship with it because almost all the time I dislike what I end up with when I use Vocodex. So it's really just, it's hit or miss, but it is a really powerful vocoder if you know how to use it. A lot of this stuff is just by ear. Bandwidth order, your bands, these are all going to change the sound a lot, and these attack and release times as well. If you want to go even faster, you can turn off minimum times. That distorts it. If you have attack and release all the way down, it's almost like a wave shaper. I'm boosting the mids a lot because with the vocoder it either gets rid of all the mids or it makes them way too loud, and I guess in this case it made them too quiet. That's your noise turned into a noisy, clicky texture. I guess technically I settled on two different endpoints, but really the in-between stuff is not so bad either. Probably a bunch of this stuff I could see myself using in my music, even if it's just like a background element. The last resampling session I started with sine waves. And I didn't high pass them this time. So I'm once again in the 3x oscillator. I've got a sine down 2 octaves and then up a fifth from that, and I'm doing amplitude modulation again. This time it's up 1 semitone and it's detuned a bit. There's nothing happening in the envelopes, so if I turn on the processing, there's a little bit of, I think it's called rectification distortion. All this is doing is chopping the parts of the waveform that are the lowest in amplitude, so that's generating the frequencies here. The big stuff is all happening in multipass. So it's this disperser. I have 12 dispersers, and the frequency, they're all the same frequency, amount is all the way up, and I'm modulating it by a really fast random LFO. And that's basically giving it the sound along with this formant filter, which I didn't add initially, but I did add it in later because I wanted more of a mouth-like sound. I did end up going for a growl again. Distorting the mids and highs, and also compressing the mids because the mids were really loud. I just play it. I didn't need that much mid-frequency content, so I just compressed the shit out of it, and then 20 more decibels into a limiter. The second channel is really simple. I'm just putting it into a granulizer. The attack is all the way down, no randomness this time, and I mess with the grain spacing and the playback time. And I'm doing that negative infinity trick where I'm taking the negative infinity point and I'm just turning it up a lot in every channel. And then I'm clipping it at the end. I guess I realized I could just clip it in Maximus, so that's what I did. That's the funny part about this sound. It's got the least amount of iterations, and the last iteration has the least amount of processing, but it's the sound I ended up liking the best, so that's maybe saying that more is not always better. So those are 3 different sound design sessions I did, basically taking really simple starting points and changing them radically, making them into radically different sounds, and I'm pretty satisfied with what I got. I'm gonna try again to make another noise growl, but that's probably gonna be a bit difficult. I don't know. I don't do sound design that much, but a good rule of thumb, when you're experimenting, try doing everything you can think of that you would normally not want to do during a mixing session. Just everything that is wrong, quote unquote. Because when you're resampling, there really are no rules. It's all up to you what you can do. And these aren't, like, this isn't how to create, granular sine growls tutorial or whatever. These are just 3 sounds I made with a bunch of neat sounds in the middle. I'm just throwing them out there so you can maybe learn a bit and get some inspiration. You're probably going to have the most luck creating sounds you like when you're just messing around, having fun. And this isn't hard and fast rules like do this to get this sound. You could probably get these results going about it in any number of ways. This is just what I decided to do.